Buenos días. Damos inicio a la segunda sesión de la Cátedra Currie 2021, Capitalismo y accionistas para el siglo XXI, organizada por el Centro de Investigaciones para el Desarrollo de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Para esta versión de la cátedra contamos con la participación del invitado internacional Karthik Ramanna, profesor de la Escuela de Gobierno Blavatnik de la Universidad de Oxford. Recordamos que tendremos la tercera y última conferencia el martes 26 de octubre a las 10:30 de la mañana, titulada Gestión empresarial en una época de indignación. Desde ya, cordialmente invitados. Hoy desarrollaremos la siguiente agenda. Presentación del invitado por parte del moderador de la conferencia, profesor Jorge Iván Bula, director del Centro de Investigaciones para el Desarrollo de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Conferencia, segunda sesión, la responsabilidad social de los negocios, por el invitado internacional, profesor Karthik Ramanna. Comentarios a cargo del profesor asociado de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional, Juan Javier Saavedra. Y por último, cerraremos la sesión con la sesión de preguntas por parte de nuestros participantes que nos están acompañando a través de las redes sociales de la facultad y de Televisión Unimedios. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la segunda sesión de la Cátedra Currie 2021. Muchas gracias. Damos la palabra al profesor Jorge Iván Bula.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. I am very glad to introduce for the second session of the Cátedra Chair 2021, Professor Karthik Ramanna, Professor of Business and Public Policy of the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Professor Ramanna is an expert on business government relations, sustainable capitalism, and corporate reporting and auditing. Professor Ramanna has studied how organizations build trust with the stakeholders and the role of business in designing sensible and responsible rules of the game. Earlier, Professor Ramanna taught leadership, corporate governance, and accounting at the Harvard Business School in both the MBA and senior executive education programs. He has a doctorate from MIT's Sloan School of Management. He has served on the editorial boards of several scientific journals, which includes being co-editor of the interdisciplinary journal Accounting, Economics, and Law, and as associate editor of the Journal of Accounting and Economics, the most cited outlet in that field. At Harvard, he also held the Henry B. Arthur Fellowship in Ethics, the Marvin Bower Fellowship recognizing innovative faculty research, and a visiting fellowship at the Kennedy School of Government. He has authored dozens of research articles and case studies on non-market strategies in Africa, China, European Union, India, and the US. He has consulted with several leading business organizations worldwide. His scholarship has won numerous awards, including the Journal of Accounting and Economics Best Paper Prize and twice the International Case Center's Standing Case Writer Prize. Today's subject Professor Ramanna will undertake is on the social responsibility of business. On the 26th of October, Professor Ramanna will be joining us again for his final lecture on corporate management in the age of ultras. Professor Ramanna, please receive again a warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Jorge. This was a lovely and thoughtful introduction, and I'm delighted to be back with you for this second day. I just want to confirm that you can see the slides, right? Everyone can see the slides. Okay, excellent. So these are the slides from day 2, and I have, thanks to my IT team and the support from your side, been able to finally control the slides on my end. So just to recap, yesterday we spent time thinking about this issue of why we face the legitimacy challenge to shareholder capitalism. Why are we even having this conversation about what should shareholder capitalism in the 21st century look like? And I presented a lot of data, primarily exemplifying 3 hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that there's declining hopefulness about people's economic futures and indeed about their social and political futures, especially in some countries in the Western world, in the rich societies across the world. And some of that declining hopefulness is in fact tied to stagnating wages and stagnating economic opportunities, particularly for those in the lower half of the skills distribution in these countries. The second hypothesis we considered was around the fact that the political conditions and the policies that have resulted in this stagnation are not exogenous, but in fact are the result or the product of certain political choices made by elites in society. And people are starting to wonder, many people are starting to wonder whether those choices were in fact premeditated, whether they were in fact malicious. And that's given rise to the idea of elite capture. And a version or manifestation of the elite capture argument is what we exemplified through the case of thin political markets. And I explained what these thin political markets are. But the third ideology that I put forth to explain why we're asking this question of the legitimacy of shareholder capitalism relates to sort of the growing sense of ideological extremism and the sense that liberal democracy and the idea of a liberal society with democratic institutions, which has more or less been the maintained assumption certainly in the Western world since the end of World War II, that very premise or that very notion or belief in that social contract is coming undone. And if we were to sort of quote Sam Huntington on it, we would say that there is a sort of clash of civilizations that we are moving into in this age. And so we laid out, in some sense, some data around the diagnostics. And today, what I want to consider is some alternatives to shareholder capitalism. Say, okay, if there is, in fact, decreasing legitimacy around shareholder capitalism, then perhaps we should consider what are some alternatives to shareholder capitalism. So in the next slide, which I'll advance to now, I will outline some of these alternatives that we're looking at in the public sphere and in the political sphere today, alternatives to a shareholder capitalist-based society, a free market capitalist-based society. And I will focus in particular on one kind of alternative, in part because it has captured the debate around centrists. And that is stakeholder capitalism, the idea that we need to move away from shareholder capitalism because of all of the failings we talked about yesterday to stakeholder capitalism. Some of these other alternatives that are out there, which I'll go into detail, some small detail, not much, are in fact being considered, but they're not necessarily mainstream ideas. They're certainly being embraced by elements on the political extremes, but they may not be mainstream ideas. But if there's one mainstream centrist idea that has caught tremendous traction, certainly here in Europe, but also increasingly in the United States, it's this notion of stakeholder capitalism. So the bulk of what I want to spend my time on today is the idea of stakeholder capitalism and whether stakeholder capitalism is in fact a credible alternative to shareholder capitalism. And I'll walk through a series of arguments that might make the case for why we need to be wary of stakeholder capitalism as it's being presented. And then finally, next Tuesday, I think is the third session, I will pick up on this theme of capitalism in the age of outrage. So if I am successful today in at least alerting you to the idea that you need to be skeptical about claims on reinventing capitalism to a more stakeholder focused, then something clearly still has to change, because yesterday we talked about all of the issues that shareholder capitalism has generated. Today, I'm going to make the claim that we still need to keep shareholder capitalism. So then I need to give you some sort of way forward. I can't say, well, the system is broken, but you want to keep it anyway. I say, okay, well, how do we make some changes on the margin? Or maybe not just on the margin, but they may be structural changes, but within the idea of free market societies. What would those changes look like? And that will be the focus of my talk next week, which is the final talk on capitalism in the age of outrage. But let's spend some time thinking about alternatives to shareholder capitalism today. It's only fair that we do so, given that yesterday the key focus of my remarks was that shareholder capitalism is evincing tremendous sort of anguish and angst and anger across particularly rich societies around wage stagnation and around ideological and structural capture. Um, and so if you look at sort of the gamut of policy responses that are out there in the political sphere today as alternatives or replacements to shareholder capitalism, here is a list of five. Now, I'm not pretending that this list is in any way mutually exclusive or collectively exhaustive. But I think that it does represent, broadly speaking, the gamut of views that are out there in the political sphere. So let's just consider these in turn. The first is the increased production of public goods. And this is one way to think about it is the rising interest in socialism across even countries like the United States, which were supposed to be bastions of free market capitalism. In fact, one survey data from 2018, I think it was, out of the Institute of Politics at Harvard Kennedy School, suggested that amongst Americans 18 to 30, more of them are sympathetic to socialism than to free market capitalism. This is American data. This is not France. So it is a sort of increasingly interesting idea, especially to young people in rich societies. But indeed, I mean, look at what's happened in your neighboring country of Venezuela, which was 20 years ago a bastion of sort of what you would think of as a market society, what we would think of as a market society in a middle-income country. And it has been completely reimagined, some would argue much for the worse, and I might agree with them. But as we look at the sort of the interest in socialism and the idea that more and more goods need to be taken out of private markets and put into public sphere, into public production, this is something that we need to grapple with. And in the United States, one of the big political debates was around the Medicare reform, and particularly around creating a system of universal healthcare. And I mean, compared to other rich countries, universal healthcare is sort of, here in Britain, we all have to do universal healthcare under the National Health Service. But in America, we never thought of universal healthcare as something that needed to be part of the social contract, in part because there was this profound faith in free markets being able to allow people to make choices for themselves on the degree and extent of medical protection they sought. But increasingly, there is a sense that some of these goods need to be in the public rather than the private sphere. The second sort of idea that has been put out there is to say, look, if free markets are producing vastly unequal outcomes, then one way to support these free market outcomes without, in some sense, killing the goose that gives us disruptive technological revolutions and gives us all the incredible technologies that allow us to, for instance, have iPhones or have the internet, etc., is to create more consumption subsidies. And perhaps not surprisingly, some of the support for these kind of consumption subsidies comes from the technology industry, and particularly from Silicon Valley, where you have many Silicon Valley billionaires and trillionaires arguing for a universal basic income. They say we're going to make all of these artificial intelligence technologies in the next 20, 30 years that's going to put all of us out of jobs. So the only way to do this without having the Bastille stormed is to have some sort of consumption subsidy, some sort of universal basic income. And of course, there are plenty of criticisms of UBI, in part because, for time immemorial, philosophers have recognized that so much of our dignity comes from our ability to create value for people, for other people. And so there is dignity in work itself. And the idea that people get paid for doing nothing, creates sort of a society that is robbed of its dignity, but also importantly creates a society that is critically dependent on a very few elites. It takes us back to sort of feudal times the sort of society we hoped we had escaped with the Industrial Revolution. But certainly UBI is something that we're seeing not mainstream political support in the United States or indeed in the United Kingdom, but in some countries like Finland, etc., it has gained some political traction. The third sort of solution out there, policy solution out there, is what I'll call production subsidies. And perhaps one sort of economic term that's often used to capture this idea is the notion of economic nationalism. If you're providing production subsidies, you need to define the geography of those subsidies in a way that you're not subsidizing producers outside of your tax base or outside of your vote base. And the best way, of course, for jurisdictions to do this is to create national boundaries on these subsidies. And the way that manifests effectively is in import tariffs. So Donald Trump is probably the person most responsible for mainstreaming this in the US political context, but indeed some would argue across the world, because a number of economic nationalists have ridden on the coattails of Donald Trump's political movement to build their own versions of economic nationalism. Yesterday, we spoke about how 10 years ago, globalization was seen as a good word. Today, globalization is, any politician in America going out and championing globalization basically is saying this is their last time running for office because it's gone from being a good word to a bad word. So production subsidies, particularly in the context of economic nationalism, import tariffs, or whatever you want to call it, is a sort of third policy option that's on the table. As I've said, so far, these three policy options, production of private goods, public goods rather than private goods, consumption subsidies, and production subsidies, these have roughly remained, at least in sort of Anglo-American context, on the political fringes. If you're looking for one policy alternative that is, I'd say, at the heart of the political discourse in Anglo-American societies today, it is the idea that the very nature of Anglo-American capitalism, what we call shareholder capitalism, has to be reinvented, has to be reconceptualized in a way that shifts it away from shareholders to a broader set of constituencies called stakeholders. And President Biden has championed this. Center-right politicians have championed this. So it's interesting. We have a center-left government in the United States and a center-right government here in Britain. And both the center-right government here in Britain, and Boris Johnson, and the center-left government of Joe Biden are championing stakeholder capitalism in some form or the other. So I'd say that for those of us who think that there is some merit to shareholder capitalism, the idea that we most need to grapple with intellectually is the idea of stakeholder capitalism. So in fact, the bulk of my comments, I want to focus on stakeholder capitalism for that reason, that it is the most compelling alternative being presented in the political center, at least in Anglo-American societies. Now, what the context is in Colombia, again, you will tell me, you will know far better than I will. The final sort of policy proposal I will put out there is one of shifting consumption preferences. And in fact, this is what I would argue is the most compatible method of addressing some of the pervasive and structural issues we saw yesterday within the framework of shareholder capitalism. So if we acknowledge that we've got a serious problem with inequality, with structural capture, with ideological extremism, as I laid out yesterday, but if we still insist that, we need to preserve shareholder capitalism because it is the bedrock or the basis of a liberal society, of a free society, in the words of Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman, then something still needs to change. And one thing that could change that's consistent with shareholder capitalism is shifting consumption preferences. Because, of course, if consumers demand different things, then producers will produce those things. That's the power of markets. And my remarks on Tuesday next week, when we talk about managing in the age of outrage, corporate management in the age of outrage, will actually focus on this final bullet of consumption preferences. But today, I'm going to focus on stakeholder capitalism and that point there. Okay. So I mean, the question I guess I've set up for us for the rest of my time here is stakeholder capitalism a good idea? And I'm going to lay out basically three sets of arguments for why we need to think really carefully about embracing the current, in some sense, fashion around stakeholder capitalism. Lots of people are jumping on it. Fortune 500 CEOs are signing statements about profits with purpose. Business school professors are reinventing themselves as gurus around, doing the right thing. And so this is the fashion. Everybody is doing it. Everybody that I know of in the business school world is writing a book about how you can be purposeful corporation and this and that. And quite frankly, I'm a little skeptical of all that. And let me explain why. So let's start with the question of why are we in this mess to begin with, right? Why are we looking at this question, which is what we did a little bit yesterday? And I told you a little bit about my journey with to this question through thin political markets, and the exemplar for thin political markets in my 2015 book with University of Chicago Press was the production of accounting rules in the economy. And I said, look, I spent about 15 years prior to that studying how accounting rules around things like derivative transactions, mergers and acquisitions, foreign currency translations, etc., were being formed. And I was astounded by how small the groups of people were that were creating these rules that effectively determined how we all live our lives, well outside the democratic system. And in the case of, say, mergers and acquisitions, over the 20-year period that I studied the evolution of those rules, there was about 44 trillion with a T dollars, US dollars, of M&A activity in the US. Enormous value. And you say that actually somewhere between 5 and 50 people, 5 and 50 people in the world had a role in determining those rules. You're like, wow, such a small group of people were shaping basically the rules for $44 trillion worth of economic activity. So when I wrote this book, and I was invited by a friend of mine who was a professor at University of Chicago, who was an advisor, economic advisor to a top regulatory agency in Washington, D.C. And he said, well, why don't you come and present your book, because it's so provocative, to the regulators? I said, sure, I'd be delighted. Academics, we love to go give talks to people because otherwise nobody wants to listen to us. So we go and we talk to regulators and so forth. So I went. And I sent my slides in advance because, as you learned from yesterday, I'm completely technically sort of inept, and so I have to send slides in advance. And I got a call the morning of my talk from the chief of staff to the regulator, and they said, in slide 5, you criticized this particular audit firm, but a senior person from that audit firm is now one of the regulators here. And we don't want to upset them. So can you change the slide and take the name of that audit firm out? You must imagine, this is not, not North Korea. This is Washington, D.C. And I was saying, look, this is a presentation about regulatory capture. And you're telling me, the irony is you're telling me to change the slide in a presentation about regulatory capture. There's something, at least I know there's some truth in my argument now, if I had any doubt about it. So why do I tell this story? I say the story because I asked the question, does anyone seriously believe, when they talk about profits with purpose and so forth, that corporations will do the right thing, quote unquote, when nobody's looking? Right? That's the question I want to ask. I want people to just ask and answer in their own mind, right? Look, when everybody's looking, it's very easy to do the right thing, because then you have the accountability, you have the media presence, you become the hero, etc. But what we're asking corporations to do when it comes to profits with purpose, when it comes to particularly things like lobbying in thin political markets, but so many other kinds of things where corporations will be expected to act responsibly, is to do the right thing when nobody's looking. And I would argue that it is not in the corporation's DNA to do that. In fact, corporations are created to make money. So if you say there's opportunity, there's $100 bill on the sidewalk and nobody's looking, and you're a business that was created to make money, you're going to pick up that $100 bill on the sidewalk. You're not going to walk away from it. No business will walk away from it because business was created to make money. So the idea that you'd have profit with purpose is good and useful, and later on I'll come back to that notion, but it's not going to work when nobody's looking, and that's when you need it to work. You need it to work most when nobody's looking. And of course, it's not just the issue of lobbying on, say, things like accounting rules. My colleague Luigi Zingales at University of Chicago wrote a great case study on Walt Disney and its lobbying on copyright protections. And he says, if you want to predict when the US extends copyright protections for intellectual property, you need to look at when the patent protection for Mickey Mouse is going to expire. And without fail, the US will change the rule from, so it started off, I think, as 25 years, then it became 40 years, then it became 65 years, now it's 90 years. So I said, without fail, if you want to predict when the US is going to revise its copyright protection, just need to look at when the Mickey Mouse patent is coming up for expiry. And then, of course, suddenly, the US says, well, actually, there's great value in extending. Now, why would you need to protect the copyright for a creative artwork that was created 90 years ago? What is the public purpose to do that? I mean, you need some sort of patent protection to spur intellectual activity. But 90 years after creating a toy mouse, you need to protect the copyright of it? That, there's no public purpose. It certainly helps Disney make lots of money, which, is a different matter. But there's no public purpose to it. So that's another example of this sort of issue. Of course, every time I have a CEO who I'm routinely asked to debate CEOs who are talking about profits with purpose, because I'm one of the few people who is foolish enough to take on the CEOs in debates. And every time I'm asked to debate them, my go-to strategy is to look at the record of corporate tax avoidance by the company. And unfailingly, with every CEO that I've had to debate on the topic of profit with purpose, usually the CEO is there to tell us how they have the most ethical company. I can provide evidence of tax evasion by that company. Right? So if you're talking about profit with purpose, the first purpose I would say is to pay your taxes. I mean, if you don't pay your taxes, what purpose do you have? So that goes back to this question of, will corporations do the right thing when nobody's looking? And my answer is, I would be astonished if they did. But of course, I leave it to you guys to have your own answer on this. The second sort of point, I think, to pick up on this is the idea that, look, part of the reason we're having this conversation about is, shareholder capitalism still legitimate in the 21st century is because business has been wildly successful over the course of the last 30, 40 years in America, and indeed in sort of Anglo-American societies. And in fact, we had presented yesterday some data from India. If you look at emerging markets more generally, so much value has been created by commercial activity. Now, that's a great thing. That's a good and useful thing. Business has actually, I would say, done its job. Business has done its job by making money because the business of business is business. It's the business of business is profit. And it has produced record profits. There's some great evidence by Simca Barkai at London Business School, which I love because it's just so compelling and clear, which is looking at the share of corporate profits that go to labor versus capital. And you just see sort of, increasing returns to capital, decreasing return to labor. I would say that actually from the perspective of shareholders, if you say the purpose of business is to make money, then business has succeeded beyond its wildest dreams. So what has failed? Well, I'd say governments have failed. I'd say civil society has failed. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, when Milton Friedman famously or infamously wrote the New York Times piece about the social responsibility of businesses to increase profits, civil society was very, very powerful. Media was very powerful. It was very establishment. They controlled the political narrative. Churches were very powerful. Religious organizations, the Catholic Church was very powerful, but also evangelical churches across the Western world were very powerful. Universities were more powerful. People respected professors much more so than they respect them today, or at least I feel like I don't get a lot of respect, but that may just be me. But if you look at all of these civil society institutions, they haven't done as well as business. The role of media, the power of media in society has declined. The power of churches and religious organizations in society has declined. And the trust and respect in governments has declined. So I'd say business has actually done its part by producing money. What has not done its part, what has failed, perhaps, is government. What has failed is civil society. So the solution to saying business has done well and governments and civil society has failed is not to put business, therefore, in charge of the role of governments and civil society. That's why I say, do you reward the fox by putting it in charge of the hen house? The fox has been really successful hunting the hens. And we say, wow, so as a reward for your success, you are now the captain of the hen house. That would be a profoundly stupid thing to do. Say, well, the fox is always going to do what it does, which is capture the hens. If the fox is getting more and more successful at it, we need to build stronger hen houses. We need to have more principled people captaining those hen houses, not putting the foxes in charge of the hen house. That would be how I would frame that. So, in fact, reward business for doing what it has done so well, but recognize that it is not the purpose of business to create equality in society. It is the purpose of business to create wealth in society. It is the purpose of business to create wealth through technological transformation. And I would say on these dimensions, business has done incredibly well. It is the purpose of governments and civil society to then hold businesses morally accountable, through taxation, through other kinds of redistributive mechanisms, etc., to create the kind of social justice. So social justice is something I deeply care about, but I don't think it is the realm of business because business is not geared up for it. One of the most compelling innovations in politics, in democratic government, over the course of the last 300 years is the notion of separation of powers. The idea that you have checks and balances across branches of government. You have an executive branch, you have a legislative branch, you have a judicial branch. The legislative branch creates the rules, the executive branch executes the rules, the judicial branch interprets that. Imagine for a moment that the legislative branch was failing and not creating the rules it needed to, or the executive branch was failing and not implementing the rules as it was supposed to. Would you put the judicial branch, therefore, in charge of the executive branch and the legislative branch? Or imagine if the judicial branch was structurally corrupt. Would you say, well, therefore, let's put the president in charge of the courts? Nobody would say that. That would be a profoundly stupid thing to do, because checks and balances across institutions are what keep those institutions honest. In the same sense, when you create business, government, and civil society, these are three legs of a stool, each required to perform their distinct roles in society. And the solution to one or two of those legs, government and civil society, failing, is not to subvert the principle of separation of powers and put business in charge, but to say, how do I strengthen those two legs? Because separation of powers will result in or the deprecation of separation of powers will result in a very, very dangerous sort of concentration of powers in the hands of one institution, which in this case is business. Institutions work because they are united by shared purpose. Individuals are very complex. I, as an individual, have many different preferences. Today I'm talking about economics. Tomorrow, one of my hobbies is Renaissance art, and in particular the art of Caravaggio. And so I might be doing something, reading some books about Caravaggio, etc. Individuals have, complex preferences, and they have very complex utility functions. But when you organize individuals into institutions, what brings them together is the shared purpose of those institutions. What is the vision and the mission of those institutions? If you believe in the vision and mission of the institution, then you join the institution and you play a part in that. So while individuals are complex and have multiple identities and values, an institution with multiple identities and values often falls apart. In fact, when you build institutions that don't have a shared purpose, then people don't know what they're doing there. That's part of the reason why we create and we carve out separate institutions, right? Even within government, we say, okay, one institution will be focused on intelligence gathering, one institution will be focused on healthcare delivery, one institution will be focused on education, one institution will be focused on securities regulation, etc. Why do we create different institutions? Because we want them to have a shared purpose. And we want to aggregate them into the highest common shared purpose we can find for them to be useful. But if it's higher than that, where we have too many shared purposes, then we don't know what the role of the institution is. And by taking businesses which were created to produce money, to produce profits, and saying you have to have all of these shared purposes, which is the job of government, like social justice or environmental protection and etc., then what you do is you set up a scenario where you take the one of the three institutions in your society that is doing well, and you set up the conditions where it does poorly. In fact, if you go back to the reason why Milton Friedman wrote the article he did in 1970 around the social responsibility of business being to increase profits, he wrote it because he felt, rightly or wrongly, that too many businesses in America had become, quote unquote, fat and happy. They were too focused on all these other things. And in fact, in those days, the thing that America was really worried about was competition from Japan. Today, it's competition from Japan's neighbor. But in those days, we thought Japan was going to take over the world. And I said, Japanese businesses are so focused on creating value. And American businesses are so focused on doing all these 500 different things, and they've forgotten how to create value and make money. And so Friedman said, no, your role is to make money, and leave the rest to all of these institutions like media, civil society, etc. And now, of course, what has happened is all those institutions that existed at the time Friedman wrote what he wrote don't exist, or don't exist to the same strength that they did. But business is actually focused on the thing that it needs to do. So I think the idea that we give business this kind of power, that it is deliberately constructed to be excluded from, that is political power, the power to engage in political conversation and to become a legitimate political actor, that's a very dangerous thing to do. And it raises the specter of what I call, well, actually, it's not I who call it that, it's James Quack who coined the term of cultural capture. I used a different term called ideological capture, but I actually prefer Quack's term of cultural capture. The specter of cultural capture. And what do we mean by that? We mean that actually, if you think about all the lobbying that has happened in the world, the thin political markets that I talked about, where corporations are capturing the accounting rules, or the Luigi's work on the Walt Disney capturing the patent rules, or all the tax evasion laws and so forth. We are so lucky, I would argue, that corporations have focused their lobbying efforts on making money. Imagine for a moment if corporations were not restricted to the realm of making money. Then suddenly Amazon's lobbying, or Facebook's lobbying, or Microsoft's lobbying wouldn't just be about making money. It would be about having a view on gun rights, or having a view on whether people are allowed to wear hijabs, or having a view on abortion, or, right? Do you really want Facebook to have a view on abortion? Do you want Amazon to have a view on gun rights? I mean, that seems like a purely political decision. Once you open the spigot for businesses to have legitimate space in politics, to have the space to fill in the role of governments and to get engaged in redistributive politics, then it is legitimate for business to say, well, if I'm going to be involved in redistributive politics, let me tell you what is the right kind of politics and what is the wrong kind of politics. That's not a world I think we want to live in. That's feudalism. We sort of threw that world out 250 years ago. We didn't have corporations then, we had feudal masters, but corporations would very quickly become feudal masters if you put them in that political place. So I think that now it is true that people, when I talk about this argument about, giving corporations this kind of political space, hold up Germany as an example, and German capitalism in particular, but also you could look at Nordic capitalism, Norwegian, Swedish capitalism, Danish capitalism, but German, let's just call it Germanic capitalism, as an example, and say, look, it works so well in Germany. Corporations in Germany have broad political rights. They're involved in redistributive politics. They're and Germany is still a liberal society. And I would argue that the reason it works in Germany is because Germany is still a very, very homogeneous society. And certainly the Nordic societies are even more homogeneous than Germany. If you are living in a heterogeneous society where you've got lots of different political views, then the idea that you can have corporations in charge of making decisions on redistributive politics, that becomes much trickier. Because then you can't expect those CEOs to have the wide consensus of society when they make certain decisions. So for instance, imagine, look, the hard decisions are not the decisions about whether, to make environmentally friendly products when your customers demand them. Of course, you make environmentally friendly products when your customers do. The hard decision is not whether you have to have good corporate governance, like, say, independent boards and so forth. Of course you do, because even shareholders want that. I mean, those are all easy decisions. I'd say that corporate governance, the vast majority of what we call corporate governance research in economics, focuses on how to align the perspective of managers with long-term value creation. And that's a very good and useful thing, and it should continue. But those are not the things we're talking about. That's the easy stuff. The things we're talking about are, what do you do with a corporation that owns a plant that will never make a profit again, but that is the only source of employment in its local community? So for instance, one of the largest steel factories here in the UK has, for I think something like 60% of its costs are pension obligations. Okay, that steel company is never going to make profits. Now, the only reason to keep that steel company alive is that if it weren't alive, then Britain would not have any domestic steel, which is a tremendous national security risk. But that might suggest that you want to nationalize it. It's not something that should stay in the private sector. But if 60% of your costs are pensions, not just salary, it's pensions, right? So it's not even current salary, it's pensions. Then that, in a pure capitalist system, that should be closed down. The question is, should you keep that business alive, and should shareholders pay the price? And of course, shareholders shouldn't pay the price, because the shareholders are basically who? They are the same pensioners. May not be in that steel company, but a pensioner from, say, an insurance company down the road, or a pensioner from the university up the street, right? Those will be the pensioners investing in capital markets, whose money is then invested in this loss-making steel plant. That's a profoundly circular and disruptive way to run an economy. Now, the reason that works in a country like Germany, where they make a lot of these decisions, is because it's such a homogeneous society. And there is sort of a relative broad social consensus. Now, that has been coming apart in the last 10 years or so, and it's creating all kinds of seismic sort of tensions within German politics. But compared to certainly Anglo-American societies like the UK or the US or Canada or Australia, which are far more diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse, culturally diverse, linguistically diverse, you can't have that kind of corporate control, because, do you use pensioners' money from Wisconsin to keep a factory, from California to keep a factory alive in Wisconsin? Right? Who makes that call? Should some CEO have to make that call, or should governments make that call? I'd much rather democratically elected governments make that call than it be the arbitrary decisions of corporations. So this point about making the distinction between, what we're calling the value of shareholder capitalism over stakeholder capitalism, or the dangers of stakeholder capitalism in particular, and long-term value creation, which is good for business. I think it's important to separate those. What we're not talking about is that corporations should never do ESG. Of course they should, because in many cases, I'd imagine in the vast majority of cases, doing ESG is good for business. So when the CEO of Unilever or Bank of America or whoever it is comes out and says, we are a purposeful business, part of the reason they're saying that is because it's good for business. And I see nothing wrong with that, because at the end of the day, customers of Unilever will not buy their products if they felt that Unilever was not doing the right thing, or that tested its products on animals, or whatever it is, or that excessively polluted the environment and so forth. So very often doing the right things in the context of the environment or of societal obligations, or indeed even with governance, is aligned with long-term value creation. And in fact, when it is aligned, smart CEOs embrace it. But there are a class of problems where they are not aligned, like tax evasion. This is why even the most purposeful CEOs run companies that are tax evaders. Look at Google, look at Apple, look at Microsoft, etc. Even Unilever, for that matter. When it comes to things like lobbying, when it comes to things like keeping open a plant if that is protecting local jobs, even if those jobs are never going to be profitable for the company. Those are the sorts of things where we can never expect companies to do the right thing, because they're never going to make money on that. And so my point is not that business will never do the right thing. Before I came here and was director of the Oxford MPP, I used to teach the required course on business ethics at Harvard Business School. So I'm a big champion of businesses doing the right thing. I'm just saying, don't build public policy under the impression that business is going to do the right thing when nobody's looking, because there isn't a single shred of evidence that will suggest that that is what will happen. So business will do the right thing, and often does the right thing when it knows that it can make long-term value from that. And in fact, smart CEOs always do that, and they don't require professors of business ethics to go and teach them to do that. They're so smart, they figure it out on their own. But it is absolute folly to build public policy in society where you assume that businesses will do the right thing when no one is looking, right? So don't build public policy around the idea that business will do the right thing. But, when business does do the right thing, then, they'll make money and we'll all be happy, and we won't sort of begrudge them that. So look, at the end of the day, business has a role to play in society, and that is a good and useful thing, which is making money. And if businesses in your country or my country didn't make money, that would be a disaster for all of us. We want businesses to go out there and make money. As Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious. There's something great about that. Go out and do that. But it is naive and dangerous to assume that businesses will do anything else than make money, especially when nobody's looking. And, just as those who imagine that government will be the fount of commercializing new technology. I mean, people will say things like government, is going to be the driver of innovation and so forth. Say, well, look, government has many roles. That role includes providing basic research for funding for university research, et cetera, providing insurance for people who really need it. So social insurance and Social Security, some would argue it extends to Medicare and so forth. But one thing government is not good at, nobody has pointed to structural and systemic evidence that government is good at driving efficiency through scale and scope, right? There is no structural evidence out there to suggest that government drives efficiency through scale and scope. The only institution that we know of in liberal societies that can do that is business, and particularly business focused on profit making. The profit motive under competition, and those are two important words, profit and competition. You need the profit motive and you need the existence of competition as an equilibrating force. But the profit motive under competition is the only known engine of efficiency through scale and scope. Governments have never been known to do that. And no society can exist without that level or degree of efficiency in wealth creation, because it is the fount of public revenues. The final thing I'll say before I stop and turn it over to the discussion is no society and no civilization in history has ever existed without individuals doing the right thing at some point in their life, even when no one's looking. So just as much as I argue that don't count on businesses as institutions to do the right thing when no one is looking, because businesses are institutions, business is not a person, and people are not businesses. Individual citizens will always be called to act above their interest, above their own narrow self-interest, when they are born with privilege, or when they have come to positions of great privilege through their own effort or through the effort of others. One of the things that we do as university professors is train people in positions of incredible privilege. Very few people in any society get to go to universities. And we train people who are privileged. They're usually the top 10, top 20% of society, sometimes the top 1%, 2% of society. But we train them to do the right thing when no one is looking. And in fact, the course I teach here at Oxford, which will be the focus of my next talk, is on leadership. So what I'm not arguing for is the end of leadership, because no society, no civilization in the world has ever thrived without leadership. That is, some individuals doing the right thing at least some point in their lives. Without that, civilization would collapse. But you don't build public policy around businesses doing the right thing all the time. So for that reason, I would argue that stakeholder capitalism is a naive and dangerous idea, and that notwithstanding all of the flaws we saw of shareholder capitalism yesterday, we have no better alternative to the notion that the business of business is business. We have to fix government and we have to fix civil society, but we don't fix them by putting business in charge of their portfolios. Let me stop there and turn it over to discussion and question and answers.
Well, it's my turn now. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Bula for the invitation to be here with you. I don't know if you listen to me. Yes, I think you are listening to me. Good morning to everyone, for the to professors and the students that are with us. First of all, thank you, Professor Ramanna, for being here with us from the University of Oxford and for sharing your interesting analysis about the social responsibility of business. You have developed today and yesterday a very interesting discussion about the relationships between the corporations and the state and the regulation that there must be between the two. Before the questions of the audience, I would like to share with you some ideas that arise from your presentations of these 2 days and from the reading of some of your papers. I'm going to mention certain elements that you have developed yesterday and others that you have developed today. The first element that I think it's important in your analysis of the problems associated with stakeholder capitalism as a way to respond to shareholder capitalism is that this is a very important issue, is that you don't explicitly use the word corporatism. You haven't used it, nor in your paper, nor in your presentation. But you make an analysis that I share, and that in a certain way resonates with the analysis that has been made by several academics about the concept of corporatism. In general, corporatism is a specific process in which interest groups are articulated in political exchange with the state agencies. From this point of view, corporatism has two conditions. The first one is the existence of groups that concentrate interest and that are capable of influencing the state. And the second one is the intervention of the state to benefit the interests of these groups and corporations. In fact, I remember a very provocative work that was produced in the 90s about this subject. It wasn't an academic paper, but an essay. The book is named The Unconscious Civilization by John Ralston Saul, an academic and an essayist and a writer from Canada. In this book, he said that corporatism implies a change in the sources of legitimacy. In monarchy, legitimacy comes from God. In democracy, legitimacy comes from the agreement of the citizens. But in corporatism, legitimacy seems to come not from citizens, but from the interest groups and from corporations. And from this point of view, corporatism can be seen not only as a distortion of market economy principles, but even as a distortion of democracy. In fact, the influence of corporations in political decision-making has been very well studied in developed countries, but I think it should be more studied in our context, because as you already know, the Latin American countries, and in particular Colombia, we haven't been strangers to this phenomenon. If you look, for example, at our history, there has always been a very close relationship between the corporations and the state. There are some interesting research developed by scholars at the National University, for example, that show the great impact of business association and of business leaders in the formulation of economic policy and in general, as you call it, the formulation of the rules of the game. In Colombia, the revolving door that you mentioned in your work is frequent. And one can say, as you said yesterday, that this is not intrinsically bad, because you have to use the knowledge of those leaders. But the problem is that in the practice, one of the main consequences of this situation is that we have a process of state capture in which the reform of important policies have been stopped by a collusion between powerful companies and political leaders. And as a result of this situation, as it has been shown, for example, by the works of Professor Jairo Villabona, who is one of the professors of our school, Colombia is a sort of tax haven for the wealthy people and for the big companies. And I told you that I was going to mention some topics that we developed yesterday. By the way, I recommend to you to talk to Professor Villabona in the process of collecting the empirical material for the case that you are writing about the tax reform in Colombia in Oxford, because he has done an interesting analysis about this tax reform and can help you counterbalance the narratives that explains the resistance of the population. In fact, I'm not very sure that low issue salience can be considered one of the main causes of population resistance. I would believe that the protests even show that the population considered this to be an important issue. Another different matter is the technical complexity of the proposal. But even in this field, there is some research done, among others, by Professor Villabona that showed that the proposal was debatable, at least from an economic and a technical point of view. But I am regretting right now. One of the reasons why I welcome the kind of research that you are doing and you are presenting today is that I think it's important to make a critical analysis about the current situation of capitalism and about the mainstream solutions proposed to fix it. The problem of some business schools in Latin America, but in general in the world, is that these kind of practices are not only not studied critically, but in many cases they are seen as normal and even as desirable. Listening to your lecture, reading your papers, and knowing, for example, that you directed a master in public policy, there is a question that comes to my mind. Is what is the role, and I think you are going to answer this question in the next session, what is the role of business schools in understanding and dealing with these issues? In the late 90s, Saul criticized business schools for their instrumental training and their emphasis on forming a technocratic elite that disdains the importance of public good. And you mentioned yesterday that one of the characteristics of a thin political market is that the commercial interest is collocated with the technical knowledge. And this is, in a certain way, one of the critics of Saul. Some business and economic schools are educating people whose knowledge, whether they work in the corporation or in the government, is put mainly at the service of the commercial interests of corporations, but not at the service of the general interest. This is why I believe that from the discussion that you have developed these 2 days from your text, and I'm sure from your next presentation, we can extract some ideas about the role of business schools in facing this problem. The first one, I think, is the impulse of the critical thinking of the students and the development of critical research. This implies several things. The first one is to show to the students that they are, as you said, they are not only, or they are not going to be only members of a corporation, but also members, and above all, members of a society. And I know, as you say, that this is difficult because in a given situation, the hat of a business person tends to prevail over the hat of the citizen. And in this sense, I think it would be useful to foster that kind of independence of judgment that is a product of enlightenment. But I think also that this kind of thing, also implies a supportive, but also a critical position regarding political and business leaders. I think that then in some cases, business schools in general tend to glorify the figure of the leader to the point of thinking that their interests always match the interests of the society. And as you have shown today, this is not always the case. Maybe sometimes, but this is not always the case. And finally, it implies, I think, a reflection about the social responsibility, but a reflection that includes even the possibility of studying, for example, the relevant cases of corporate irresponsibility. To take the corporate irresponsibility like an agenda, like a research agenda, in order to show the students, among other purposes, the complexity of the problems and dilemmas that they will have to face in their organizational everyday life. And the second element that I can extract from your presentation and from your text is the necessity to develop in the students the ability, but also the habit of proposing solutions to social problems. Realizing that you as an individual or as an organization, you cannot solve them by yourself, but you can make a contribution to the possible solution. You have done an interesting work today and yesterday analyzing different responses to the problems of shareholder capitalism, and in particular the alternative of stakeholder capitalism. But this is important because I think this is a task that we have as a School of Business and as a School of Accounting and as a School of Economics, to take an active role in this discussion. I think this discussion is being developed in the political sciences and so on, but business schools, we are not sufficiently implied in this discussion. And this is why I think it must be useful, maybe, to encourage
Javier, estás, comunicación se cortó. So sorry.
Sorry. I don't know if I'm sorry, do you listen to me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm about to finish. This is why I said I think it's useful to encourage the participation in foresight and future studies in the School of Management, because when you make an exercise like this, this kind of methodologies require an interdisciplinary approach, but also because through the analysis of inertial scenarios, they allow participants to acquire a sense of urgency and a sense that is very essential to motivate real action. And of course, the kind of exercise that you tell that you are doing in your class in Oxford, using literature, philosophy, history to develop the imagination, the creativity, but also the specific kind of sensibility that is needed to face social and environmental problems, and not only economic problems. These kind of exercises that try to show to the student that he is not a business person only, but a member of a society and a member of the humankind is important in order to create that kind of sensibility. And finally, with this kind of ideas, that those are the kind of ideas that I can articulate from your two very interesting talks. I would only have two questions. The first one is if there is any relationship between the type of problems, the kind of problems that you normally study in your research, and the corpus of theories about corporatism, if there is a relationship between these two elements. And the second one, and I will understand if you don't answer it today, because this is going to be the object of your next presentation, is what is your opinion about the roles of the schools of accounting, management, and economics in the face of the challenges imposed by contemporary shareholder capitalism? That's all. Thank you very much again, Professor Ramanna, and thanks to Professor Bullet for the opportunity of discovering your work that I find very interesting and very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Javier. Thank you, Karthik. So you have already two questions from Juan Javier. Professor Ramanna.
Yeah. No, and thank you, Javier, for that really thoughtful discussion. And a lot of what you said is music to my ears. And it's wonderful that you, if I understood correctly, you're a professor in the business school, and that you are thinking about these issues because, as you have rightly identified, it's really important that these issues are being conceptualized and part of the curriculum and the conversation in business schools. And that was part of the reason why I, quite frankly, started teaching the business ethics course. Although I trained as an economist, you say, well, what is an economist doing teaching business ethics? This is the most important thing anyone can do in a business school. So I very much, on your point about corporatism, clearly a lot of what we talk about in the context of thin political markets or regulatory capture or ideological capture is connected to the concern about corporatism. And I'd say that, in fact, the danger with stakeholder capitalism is that it is a shorthand for crony capitalism, because when you put the corporations in charge of the state, or the not necessarily in charge of the state, but in charge of functions that the state ordinarily provides, then you start opening that spigot to sort of, what becomes sort of the co-location of state and corporation, which is sort of what you saw in Indonesia under Suharto or Malaysia under Mahathir. This idea that it was very hard to tell the state apart from the corporate entities, or the Korean chaebol, late 1990s, when there was sort of this movement towards more systematic democracy there. And that is a great concern, that stakeholder capitalism becomes a backdoor reversion to corporatism, and in particular to this crony capitalism. I will spend some time talking about business schools more broadly, or not necessarily about business schools, but about the curriculum in business schools, and how we can embrace this responsibility, this very special responsibility that we have in universities to society. And so I think that's something that we should pick up in the next theme, in part because I think it connects to this notion of how do you prepare people to be managers in the age of outrage, especially if they're saying, well, they're going out there to make profits. How do you prepare them to be effective citizens? It looks like there are a bunch of other questions coming up in the chat. Jorge, do you want me to answer those, or is there one in particular you want to identify?
No, go ahead if you wish.
Okay, so I see the first question I'm seeing here is, in what way is globalization a redeemable issue? And in what matters are we talking about something really, really bad? So look, I mean, on the face of it, globalization has been a tremendously positive thing. It has lifted hundreds of millions, if not billions of people out of poverty. And it has given a sense of confidence to certainly billions of people across the globe. For the longest time, people in formerly colonized societies or middle-income societies felt like, to be rich, you have to be in the Western world. And if you're not in the Western world, then you're basically confined to a life of low economic opportunity and low mobility and so forth. And what globalization has done is firstly lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty and put them into a lifestyle where they're, I wouldn't say middle class, but at least working class, lower middle class. And importantly, it has created a sense of optimism and confidence in themselves. And I remember one of the last trips I took out of the UK before the pandemic shut down travel for like a year or so, was to a small town in India. And of course, when you say small town in India, it means 5 million people. But what I'm joking. I mean, it's probably 1 million or 2 million or something like that. But so it's a pretty big town by any sort of standards in the UK. It would be a massive city. But what was striking to me was how many people just had a sense of entrepreneurial hustle to them. They had a sense of optimism that their lives, firstly, most of the people in these sort of young towns in India or China or wherever in sort of in sub-Saharan Africa, where you go, Southeast Asia, they are mostly super young. So the vast majority of the population will be under 25. And secondly, they will look at the next 30, 40 years of their lives as something of incredible optimism and incredible promise. They believe that if they work hard, their lives will be transformed and the lives of their children and grandchildren will be vastly better off. And that is a product of the economic fruits of globalization. So globalization is absolutely, from the objective face of things, a really powerful moral good. But at the same time, it is the same forces of globalization that have resulted in the decline and stagnation of economic opportunity in America, in Britain, in many parts of the rich world, that are responsible for the 500,000 missing Americans that Angus Dayton and Ann Case have identified in the context of their work that I talked about yesterday. So there is obviously two faces to globalization. There is obviously an issue here where we're trading off some moral rights and some moral wrongs. And we have to be able to find a way to navigate this. I mean, to shut down all globalization because there are, there are stagnating economic opportunities in some parts of the world would be a profoundly, dangerous and stupid thing to do. It's the sort of thing that precipitated, last time we saw this kind of thing happen, it precipitated a world war. So it's the sort of thing we want to tread very carefully on, sort of, turning off the tap on globalization. But realistically, if we're being honest about it, the people who have really paid the price, if there is a direct cost of globalization, the direct cost of globalization is borne by the US taxpayer, which is, I'm a US taxpayer because in the US, no matter where you are in the world, you have to pay tax in the US. So this is the gift of being an American, is you pay taxes on your worldwide income. But it is true that the US taxpayer has picked up the vast majority of the direct cost of globalization because of the way the international financial system has effectively funded some of the costs of globalization. And part of what has resulted in, both the rise of Donald Trump and also, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the other side of the political spectrum in the US, so far left and far right, is the idea that consensus where the US is the global police force, the US taxpayer is the global bill payer for, the benefits of globalization. I mean, American voters are saying, yeah, not anymore. And so we've got to find a way to effect that adjustment without collapsing ourselves into a massive world war, which is sort of what we did last time we faced this, and we can't afford that, certainly. So this is a really dangerous and sensitive time for the world to be living in, and I'd say the jury is out on it. I remain enormously optimistic about our potential to do this and to do it right. But human beings have in the past done, and leaders of human societies in the past have done profoundly stupid things too. And it all depends on having, at the very crucial moments in a country's history or an international geopolitical history, having the right people with the right mindset making the right decisions. And so far we've been lucky, and I hope that continues. Okay, we've got another question here saying, is business as a profit motive activity the same in a homogeneous society as Germany versus in a very unequal society, considering the role that the social climate may have for running a business? That's a really thoughtful question. So I'll give you the example of the Tata Group, which is a large, one of the largest conglomerates in India, and it was established about 150 years ago. It's a $100 billion enterprise. It was established 150 years ago primarily through the profits of its founder in the opium trade business. So not the most glorified start to a business empire. But they were involved in helping the British do opium trade with China. And they made their money there. And then they decided to become the first industrialists in pre-independence India. And it's called the Tata Group. So today they're a $100 billion conglomerate. They operate everything from airlines to software to steel, to making cars, to making planes, everything. They basically do everything. They're like a Korean chaebol. In fact, the Tata Group, funnily enough, is today the largest employer in the manufacturing sector in the UK. Although it's an Indian company, it owns so many UK manufacturing businesses because that's its heavy sort of focus. Now, the Tata Group is owned by 3 charitable trusts. Okay, so it's an interesting business because it's a for-profit business, but it's owned, just 67% of the equity of the Tata Group is owned by 3 charitable trusts. And what is the mission of those trusts? The mission of those trusts is to advance the quality and the flourishing of the societies where its businesses operate. Okay, so it's a circular logic. So the business operates to make money, but it's owned by a nonprofit that exists to advance human flourishing in the society in which the business operates. Now, if you are running a business in the Tata Trust, and some of the managers of the Tata Trusts are close personal friends of mine, the Tata businesses. If you're a manager of a Tata business, you have the luxury to make certain long-term decisions, long-term capital decisions, because you're operating in the interest of the long-term flourishing of the society in which you operate. But in the same way that you wouldn't have that luxury if you were just sort of, listed equity trading on a stock exchange, there you'd have the capital would be less patient. So why look at just, Germany versus other countries? Even within the context of a single country, the nature of the capital that you are accountable to itself changes the calculus for the kind of business that you need to operate. Now, at the end of the day, no business can operate without certain basic rules of the game functioning, etc. And every business, there is not a single person, including Milton Friedman, who would argue that business should violate the law in any jurisdiction in which it operates. So everything we're talking about is that business should always comply with the law of the land and with prevailing ethical custom. Even Milton Friedman said that. So those are the easy questions. The hard questions are, what do you do if you're running a business in a country like India? So what happens? So the Tata Group they own the largest steel, one of the largest steel mills in India, and it is the oldest steel manufacturing facility, I think, in all of Asia, because it was founded a long time ago in colonial times, rather, etc. And they have a company town, so it's about, I think, 1 million people that live and work in the town. The town is owned and operated by the Tata Group, And they provide, I mean, if you were in that town, you would think you were not in India, in a sort of in a Western country, because it's the one place in India where the trains run on time, where the electricity is always on, where the sewage system works, where the hot and cold run. It's just run beautifully. And they have state-of-the-art, world-class hospitals there for employees and their families, etc. And you remember a few months ago, there was a massive COVID epidemic in India, and there was like critical shortage of ventilators, etc. And suddenly this hospital, which is in the middle of some, pretty rural and deprived communities in India, was flooded with people who were not associated with the company at all, just average individuals who wanted access to their ventilators, wanted access to their oxygen, because they were dying of COVID. And if you're the Tata Group in that situation, you have no choice but to do the right thing. I mean, everyone's looking also. If you didn't do the right thing in that situation, you'd be finished as a brand. So what did they do? They opened up the hospital to everybody. Normally the hospital is only open to employees. And they said, you know what? I think it was several $1 million a day they were spending in profits on keeping those hospitals running, because that's just what they had to do. I mean, that's their brand. That's who they are. So the answer to your question is, of course, a business that's operating in a climate like that has to behave very differently than a business operating, say, maybe a purely commercial entity that is a stock brokerage that's operating in Manhattan or in Wall Street. They'll have different expectations of them. In fact, good businesses are always on top of what are the legitimate expectations that their stakeholders have of them. Not only on top of them, they're helping manage those expectations. I'll talk about this actually next week when I talk about managing in the age of outrage. If you as a business do not know what are the expectations of you from your stakeholders, you're finished. Even if you say my business is to make money, you're finished, because you have to know what your stakeholders expect of you. And that's going to vary from geography to geography. So that's the sort of the long answer to your question is absolutely yes. Can shared purposes be brought to schools? I'm assuming, so I guess what the intent of that question is that can shared purposes be taught to schools, or do schools themselves as their own strategy have to have a shared purpose? I'm not sure what the intent of the question. I don't know if you have the original question in Spanish, but if the intent was clear, I'm happy to address either. They're two different questions. Okay. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Look, in my day job, as I said to you yesterday, I'm the director of the Oxford Master Public Policy Program. We bring together 140 really bright and committed individuals in public service from 70 jurisdictions every year across the world. So far, about I think 120, 130 jurisdictions have been represented in the program. What can we possibly have in common, right? People from so many different societies. What could we have in common? What is the shared purpose that brings us together? Well, I think that there are some things. For one, everyone who comes here is united by the shared purpose of improving lives through government. Now, that is a shared purpose, but at the same time, we have very different ways or approaches of how we might do that. But at least we have that. But we have a shared purpose in an institution like ours. In universities in particular, it's very hard to have what are called substantive shared purposes. So in some sense, we cannot have a shared purpose to, say, eliminate, carbon emissions, as morally appropriate as that is. We cannot afford to have a shared purpose on, say, LGBT rights, as important as that and valuable as that is. Because universities are supposed to be places where all ideas can be discussed within the context of legitimate scholarly inquiry. And if universities start saying some ideas are correct and some ideas are wrong, then there's no social purpose to the university. So you cannot have substantive shared purpose as a university. Any university that tries to have a substantive shared purpose is basically putting the first nails in its coffin. However, universities can have procedural shared purposes. So here in the program I direct, we don't have substantive shared purposes because we probably won't be able to agree on anything. There are as many views as there are students and faculty, which is a great and lovely thing. I celebrate the tremendous ideological and intellectual diversity of my community. But we have procedural shared purpose. And what I mean by that is we are a leadership community. And by a leadership community, I mean that we are responsible not just for what we say, but we are responsible for how our words land on others, right? So a leader is not just responsible for saying something, they're responsible for having an impact on others. And so unless we have that commitment to how our words land on others, we won't be leaders. So we have, if you want to be a member of this community, Oxford MPP community, you have to commit to the procedural shared purpose rather than to a substantive shared purpose.
Thank you so much, Karthik, for this nice conversation today. We hope to see you again on the 26th. And thank you, Juan Javier, also for the comments. And thanks a lot, really, for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.